I appreciate you all being here. I know there's lots of things we could be doing, and it's heartening to see so many folks come out to learn about this issue and what we can do together to make sure we don't get saddled with another NAFTA-style trade agreement. Let me just start with the basics. So on June 26th, during the G20 meeting up in Canada, President Obama announced his intention to move forward with the Korea Free Trade Agreement starting in a big way this November. He instructed his cabinet, the U.S. Trade Representative and others, to push forward and make sure that it was ready to go and that all the final little tweaks were done by the G20 meeting that's happening in Seoul a week after our November elections. And so the first thing to know about the Korea FTA is that this is a free trade agreement that was negotiated by the Bush administration 3 years ago. It was, thank you, negotiated, signed by the Bush White House. You know, the Obama administration really had nothing to do with writing it. And so this is, again, a NAFTA-style trade agreement. It's not 100% identical to NAFTA, but the basic structure, huge parts of the text are exactly the same as NAFTA and CAFTA and the Peru FTA and many of the others. The second thing to know is that in terms of volume of trade, this is the biggest FTA since NAFTA itself. It's far bigger than CAFTA. It's far bigger than the Peru Free Trade Agreement. It actually dwarfs anything that President Bush was able to pass during his 8 years in office. And I think this is true. I haven't actually done the math, that it dwarfs everything that Bush was able to pass during his 8 years in office. But don't quote me on that one. So this, in other words, is a very, very big deal, literally and figuratively. If this moves forward, it's going to have a big impact on our economy. It has the potential to impact the environment. And our response to this proposal is going to determine the future of trade policy for at least the remainder of the Obama presidency and potentially much longer. I mean, I don't think anyone expects a president who's better on trade, you know, by 2017 at the earliest, and potentially even longer. So what we do in response to this is really going to have repercussions for quite a while. One of the first questions I often get asked when talking about the Korea FTA is why? Why is this happening? Why is President Obama moving forward with a Bush negotiated trade deal? More to the point, you know, why is he pushing forward with the biggest FTA since NAFTA in the midst of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression? I think there's a couple answers to that. Let me just start with, I don't know, I guess what I'd call the public answer, the public justifications that the White House and others give for wanting to see the Korea Free Trade Agreement pass. Folks might remember during the State of the Union address back in January, the President announced a plan to double U.S. exports within 5 years. A pretty ambitious plan. I think most Americans, frankly, would support that goal of doubling exports. It would certainly create new jobs, and that's something this country desperately needs. So the big line that we're being told about Korea, just like every other free trade agreement going back more than 15 years, is that, you know, this is going to increase our exports and thus increase jobs, okay? And, you know, and to be clear, I mean, I think in the year, if this is enacted, in the years that follow, exports to South Korea will increase, and there will be some jobs associated with those exports. But, you know, the thing that the free traders never say, which I'm sure all of you know, is that while exports may increase, imports are going to increase too. And if history is any guide, the imports are going to increase at a much, much faster rate than the exports. And just as exports are associated with job creation, imports for the most part are usually associated with job displacement. And that being the case, the overall balance of trade is what's the most important when you're looking about the economy. Yeah.
Well, this is exactly the same thing we heard from Nixon when he came to China.
It's been going on for a while. And, you know, and this is the thing that the free traders very rarely ever acknowledge. Even the U.S. International Trade Commission, which is the federal agency that, you know, that has routinely overstated the potential benefits of trade agreements over the years, even they admit, you know, in their predictions that the Korea FTA will increase the U.S. global trade deficit. The Economic Policy Institute, which is a more labor-friendly think tank and has a much stronger track record on predicting these things, they predict that this trade deal will double the U.S.-Korea trade deficit within just 7 years if it passes, and that imports from South Korea will be displacing 888,000 American jobs within those 7 years. Even if you factor in the job creation and other factors, we're talking about significant job loss in this country. In all likelihood, thousands of jobs lost here in Oregon. So when they say, the Korea Free Trade Agreement is going to increase exports, we say, well, so what? What's it going to do to the balance of trade? And they have no response to that. Interestingly, there's another angle on this whole exports question. Public Citizen's Global Trade Watch came out with a report just a couple weeks ago that actually suggests there's an export penalty associated with free trade agreements. By that I mean, not only is our balance of trade suffering under these free trade agreements, but that our exports alone are also potentially suffering under them. The study looked at 17 countries with which we have free trade agreements, and it found that exports did increase to those countries in the years that followed, but they didn't increase as quickly as exports to countries with which we don't have free trade agreements. So that's sort of an interesting angle on this thing. And I mean, even if you're, for whatever reason, just focused on exports, and you could care less about the balance of trade, even then free trade agreements, the record suggests, are a bad idea. So that sort of answers the major official justification for this. Let me just talk for a second about the political reason why they might be doing this. You look at public opinion polls, and poll after poll after poll shows that voters are dead set against free trade agreements. The Wall Street Journal just came out with a poll about a week ago that showed that 69% of Americans think free trade agreements are bad for the country, only 18% think they're good. It asked, what's the number one reason for the economic crisis and continued unemployment in this country? People said, number one, outsourcing. This is a reason why the Democrats now are doing a big Make It in America push during the election season. It's why, companies like Jeep are talking about how their cars are made in America in their ads all of a sudden. Voters hate offshoring. Voters hate free trade agreements. People know that. But there is a group that I think we all know free trade agreements are popular with, and that's Wall Street, K Street, the Chamber of Commerce, big business in general. And I'm speculating here, but my guess is that President Obama's political advisors have sort of made the political calculation that they want to show that they can deliver something on big business's agenda that a Republican president wasn't able to deliver on. I think the White House has sort of decided that if they push this trade agreement through shortly after the November election, far enough away from 2012 that it's not going to be a major media story, the base isn't really going to, be complaining about it for too long, voters will forget about it by 2012, and then they'll be able to use that while they're doing their fundraising with corporate campaign donors for the re-election campaign. And if you think about it politically, I mean, it actually makes sense. Republicans, this is probably the one issue that Republicans are not going to attack the president on. Every other issue, I mean, they have. The corporate media, if the Republicans aren't complaining, they're not going to cover it. They're just stenographers. If no one in power is saying this is bad, and there's no conflict there, it's not going to be a major issue. It might get, an article in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, but it's not going to be sustained. Even if a majority of Democrats vote against it in Congress, they're probably not going to be doing the talk shows in 2012 calling out their own president on it. And so, there's really, only one group of people that could hold the president accountable for this, and that's, you and me, and our labor unions, and our environmental groups, and our faith organizations. If we're not out there making a stink about this, there's no one else who's going to do it. And in some ways, that's maybe a little bit scary. It's up to us. But in some ways, it's a little bit empowering too. Because, and I'm going to get into this later tonight, there are signs already that the work that's being done is starting to make some cracks in the armor, that, the politicos in D.C. are reading these poll numbers and thinking, maybe people will remember this in 2012. How are we going to spin this in the next election? Oregon Fair Trade Campaign is working on a West Coast speakers tour with labor and farm allies from South Korea, which we're hoping to do in the next couple of months. The mobilization and the organizing against the FTA in South Korea has been massive. Tens of thousands of people in the street in repeated mobilizations again and again. A 10-day takeover of the Parliament building to prevent a vote. I mean, even, people lighting themselves on fire. People take this very, very seriously in South Korea. The opposition has been inspiring, heroic, and so we're going to let you hear from the people who are actually doing that work directly before too long. But I did just want people to know that what we're doing here today is very, very much in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in South Korea.
There's all kinds of things that we can talk about in terms of how these trade agreements affect democracy, but I'm just going to talk about the investor protection clauses in these trade agreements. And these clauses have been in almost all of the trade agreements that we have signed. And the only one that I'm familiar with that doesn't have some kind of such clause in it is the agreement we signed with Australia. So we know that it can be done. Australia was wise enough not to include it. Investor protection clauses allow foreign corporations to maximize profits without, or at least with very little interference by government regulations and laws. These clauses discourage the passage and enforcement of laws and regulations at all levels of government for the protection of labor, the environment, and the people. These clauses give foreign multinational corporations the ability to sue host countries if laws and regulations impede their abilities to make a profit. These suits bypass national courts. Instead, they are brought before special secret trade tribunals who can only rule on the rules of trade. They can't consider other factors, for instance, the rights of nature, the rights of labor, free governance issues, and so forth, things that are actually important to us. So very restricted focus on what they can talk about. One of the earliest NAFTA cases was a case in which a Canadian supplier of a chemical which was used in the manufacture of MTBE, which is a gasoline additive. And this additive is a possible human carcinogen, and it started in California to leak into the state's waters. And when it did that, the state of California banned its use. So the Canadian supplier, they weren't the manufacturer, they were only a supplier of one element of MTBE. So the Canadian supplier sued, claiming that their profit-making abilities had been limited. This Canadian manufacturer sued the United States because an American state passed a law to safeguard its water supplies and to safeguard the health and safety of its citizens. An American company could not have brought such a suit against the United States federal government because of an action by one of its states. Under investment protection clauses, only a foreign multinational corporation is allowed to bring such a suit. These clauses give special rights to multinational corporations and create an uneven playing field. Also note that had an American company been allowed to sue for unrealized future profits, the state of California would have defended itself at the trial or at the hearing. But yet in this MTBE case and most others, California was not even able to go to the hearing. Instead, California had to rely on the U.S. federal government to defend its position, and that position and those interests can be very different between the federal government and the states. These clauses create an uneven playing field favoring multinational corporations and allow the domestic court system to be bypassed in favor of the international trade tribunals. These tribunals meet in secret, do not even have to issue a public statement about what the outcome of the case is. In contrast, of course, American courts issue public judgments. In a more recent case, this time involving a claim under NAFTA, another Canadian manufacturer called Pacific Rim Mining Corporation has filed a claim against El Salvador because El Salvador has tried to protect its freshwater supplies. With the increase in the price of gold, multinational mining companies have set out prospects of establishing 29 silver and gold mines in El Salvador. And when they did this, they created this huge national debate in El Salvador about the possible consequences, health and environmental and so forth, of having these mines at all. So Pacific Rim wanted to establish their gold mine on the largest and most principal water river in El Salvador. And they wanted to use a very water intensive and a potentially very environmentally damaging process. So in response to this, in 1996, El Salvador established a two-step process for approving mines. And so Pacific Rim decided, in their case, not to even bother going through the second step. And that second step included, among other things, an environmental impact statement. So a very important step. But instead of going through the second steps, they went right to CAFTA and sued El Salvador, saying that El Salvador had infringed on their ability to make profit. A little oddity here was that, of course, is that Pacific Rim was in a little bit odd position to actually pursue this case because it was a Canadian company, and Canada was not a signatory to the CAFTA agreement. And so what they did is that they went to their subsidiary, which was in the Cayman Islands, and they reincorporated it in Nevada. And now, having reincorporated it in Nevada, they were able to pursue this claim through the CAFTA trade tribunal case. So, here's this deep-pocketed multinational corporation suing a very poor nation in Central America. So, in the end, even if, and this case is not settled, but even if it were to be settled in El Salvador's favor, El Salvador can ill afford the expense of defending itself. And keep in mind that there were 29 of these mines, so not all of them are taking this same course, but if they did, this would be totally the financial ruin of El Salvador. Okay. The democratic rights of people are subverted by investor protection clauses. Governments subjected to these clauses must now look over their shoulders before passing laws or regulations for fear of being challenged in foreign trade tribunals with deep-pocketed or by deep-pocketed multinational corporations. Past agreements have largely been between unequal partners. So most of these agreements have been between developed countries and underdeveloped countries. And American multinationals have been given the advantage in these various suits and so forth because of it. But the situation with the Korea Free Trade Agreement is quite different. Korea is a very developed economy with the ability and most certainly the desire to invest in the United States. And in fact, between 2001 and 2007, they have invested more than $15 billion in the United States, and some of that actually coming into Oregon as well. Korea is a capital exporter. According to Public Citizen, there are 85 Korean multinational corporations which are operating currently in the United States. And any one of those could bring suit before an international trade tribunal to overturn or at least to challenge laws that are made either at the national level, regulations made at the national level, or at the city, county, or state level. Here in Oregon, Korea has investments in a semiconductor plant, a animal feed processor, and a shipping company. Next door in Washington, their investments include air transport services, commercial banking services, marine transportation services, containerized international shipping, and international passenger and cargo air transport. Huge. That's just in Washington State. There is also fear that American companies with subsidiaries in Korea will be able to use those Korean subsidiaries to challenge American laws and regulations, just the same way as Pacific Rim was able to move their subsidiary. So, in closing, a couple of statements. If democracy demands transparency and openness, free trade agreements are anti-democratic. If democracy demands that government represent the desires and the wishes of its people, free trade agreements are anti-democratic. If democracy demands that corporations be subservient to people, free trade agreements are anti-democratic. Only decisions made by citizens at the local level can truly be democratic. We may decide to delegate some of our authority to higher representative bodies. Every time we do that, we lose our ability to democratically participate in decisions which affect us. Free trade agreements pass authority from our elected officials and from ourselves to a new level, a level allowing non-elected, non-representative, multinational corporations to challenge all of our laws if those laws are perceived to threaten corporate profits. This is anti-democratic. So we must say no to the Korea Free Trade Agreement because it, like most all of these other agreements, allow multinational corporations to usurp our democracy via the investor protection clauses. Thank you.
So my job is to talk about the financial services agreement as part of the Korea Free Trade Agreement. I want to put it in a little context and sort of remind us what it is we're talking about. You remember back when we first started talking about NAFTA and the WTO that a big part of what we were talking about that was new and different and alarming was the General Agreement on Trade and Services, Trade in Services, GATS. And services had never been included before in free trade agreements and were brought into the discussion in the WTO and in NAFTA for the first time. So that was 15 years ago that those were actually enacted. Time does fly. And the thing that was, I think, not so well understood by a lot of us at the time, when we were talking about services, we were thinking of things like telecommunications, broadcasting, entertainment, tourism, healthcare, transportation. As Elizabeth Barkley, the expert at the time on the General Agreement on Trade and Services, said, it's anything you can't drop on your foot. But the thing we forgot about, or at least didn't notice, didn't understand fully, was that the most significant part of it was the financial services. And what is a financial service is something that we're learning the hard way since the recession. I want to, before I get into the financial services agreement, just give you some numbers that I find particularly interesting and help me to understand this concept. The financial services industry, their share of total corporate profits climbed from 10% in the early 1980s to 40% at its peak in 2007. So their share of total corporate profits, okay? That's all the profits of all corporations in the United States went from 10% to 40%. Now remember, they're not making anything but money. They're making profit. That's what they do. That's what they produce, is profit. It's trading money. That's what the financial services industry does. So trading hot air rose to 40% of the corporate profits in this country. The financial services industry's share of the stock market's value, okay, so that's the value of the shares of traded corporations on the stock market, grew in that same time frame from the early 1980s to 2007 from 6% to 23%. So 23% of the value of corporate shares on the stock market belong to the financial services industry. Now, at the peak, the industry, that is by 2007, the financial services industry accounted for only 14% of our GDP, okay, and 5% of our employment. So it's hot air. It is wealthy people trading our money and getting wealthier doing it. That's what the financial services industry is. We give them our money, they play with it and make more, and we make less. And they create no jobs, they create no real wealth. Just saying. Okay, so the financial services industry was really the golden goose of the General Agreement on Trade and Services. Because of its inclusion in the WTO, Clinton had, that's right, Bill Clinton, not Hillary, Bill, 1999, had the excuse to rescind the Glass-Steagall Act. That act, which many of you recall from all we learned during this recession, was the act that had been enacted during the Great Depression to separate commercial banks from retail banks. From investment banks. I knew I was saying that wrong. I'm sorry, it's been a very long day. So to separate commercial and investment banks. We took down that firewall. All of our regulatory agencies went into sleep mode. They allowed these financial services corporations to start leveraging at 40-to-1, and the whole economy collapsed. Not just our economy, but the world's economy. Now, the financial services industry is doing just fine in 2010. The profits are back up. Their share of the stock market is back up. They are not hurting. We have to keep remembering that. This recession that working people are still suffering from, suffering more as the months go by, is not being felt on Wall Street. So who wants the Korea Free Trade Agreement? Wall Street. Why do they want it? They want it because it will prevent the Obama administration with mavericks like Elizabeth Warren from doing any serious regulation of the financial services industry, because they will have the excuse of the free trade agreement. And it will bring over the investor rights conversation that David was having, will come over into the financial services industry. Korea, as I think David said, is a capital exporter. Our economy, I have started using this phrase more and more regularly now. You've all heard about the emerging economies, right? Brazil, India, China. Our economy is a submerging economy. Our economy has exported all of its manufacturing jobs. It has exported many of its service sector jobs, and it has exported its capital. And now we are entering in for the first time into a free trade agreement with a country that is going to clean our clock in terms of the financial services industry. This is just a precursor from what's going to happen, because who is it? You can't tell these days a foreign corporation from a domestic corporation because they are all multinational corporations in the financial services industry. Unless you're talking about your local community bank or your state-owned bank, which we'll come to in a couple of years, unless you're talking about that, you are talking about multinational corporations. They are all involved in a global economy now. They are trading money from one country to another with absolutely no holds barred. And the Korea Free Trade Agreement is a way for them to be sure that there will be no regulations of too big to fail, because the Korea Free Trade Agreement prohibits limitations imposed on the size of banks, on the size of insurance companies, on the size of hedge funds, and any other financial services providers. It also prohibits or severely restricts any effort to regulate trading in toxic derivatives, because it says that you have to basically list ahead of time any regulatory measures you want to take about derivatives trading. And we don't know what measures we want to take because we don't know what new tricks they're going to come up with. Nobody had ever heard of a credit default swap before 2008. And all of a sudden, credit default swaps were capable of bringing our economy to its knees. They will come up with new tricks. They are very clever, these guys. And so if we can't regulate it unless we can name it now, our hands will be tied. So who wants this? Wall Street wants it. It is not about the health of this economy. Our exports, I was listening to a program on NPR or OPB the other day about Oregon's exports. What were the two industries that we were talking about? Wheat and coal. Those are third world countries that export their natural resources and their ag products. We have accepted our position as a third world country. And entering this agreement seals our fate in that regard. It is something that is being sold to the American people as sort of, oh, isn't it great? We're going to be exporting to Korea. Excuse me? When we're trying to build solar panel manufacturing facilities in Oregon, who are we asking to build those factories? The Koreans. Let us not kid ourselves. This is no longer an economy of the people, by the people, and for the people. We are being sold down the river. The last thing I want to say about the financial services agreement is that essentially what it will do will be to, there are, this list says 11, I think there are actually more than that, Korean financial firms now established in the United States. They will have U.S. subsidiaries. The U.S. financial firms will all have Korean subsidiaries. Those things can be set up overnight. So their right to block any regulatory efforts on the part of the Congress will be a piece of cake. All it takes is a clever trade lawyer, and Washington's full of them, and Seoul is full of them for that matter. So it is not going to be a question of, oh, just some foreign firms can use this. All Wall Street firms will be able to use this. So we can't let this happen. Thank you.
We've all heard many times that we're losing jobs to trade. And when economists note these losses, they're quick to claim that new and higher paying jobs will be available in high tech to replace those lost jobs. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about how trade has impacted both the high tech profession in general as well as my personal career. And let me start with a little background info about myself and the tech industry. I have over 25 years of experience as a software engineer. I have a Master's of Science in Software Design and Development. I develop software to run on the world's most popular operating system, Microsoft Windows. Perhaps you've heard of it. I have extensive experience with C++, a software language used to produce the vast majority of today's high-performance software. And I have experience in various fields, including healthcare, insurance, education, gaming, and above all, manufacturing. And I'm not telling you this tonight to brag, but rather to set the stage that my experiences that you'll be hearing are that of somebody already working at the upper end of the industry. So let me talk a little bit about High Tech 101. You'd be hard-pressed today to find an industry that doesn't use computers. For example, today even farming equipment is now equipped with GPS and fertilized tracking systems. Because of this pervasive use of high tech, you will find high tech in just about every industry. However, with all the progress that's been made in high tech, it might surprise you to know that no one is tracking unemployment numbers for worker occupations. Unemployment is only tracked on an industry basis. For example, a janitor who's working at Intel is considered a high-tech worker. And a computer network administrator at a hospital is a healthcare worker. It's also important to note that there's many different categories of workers in high tech. High tech has the usual division of employees and contractors, like most industries, but we also have a large number of foreign workers working here on visas. And there's many types of visas. One type of visa is the H-1B visa, which was originally designed for people with special skills that could not be obtained domestically. And the original users of this were fashion models, people like Rachel Hunter from New Zealand, who couldn't be replaced with somebody locally because she's special and can't just be replaced. Many of you probably have already heard of the H-1B, but there's also a lesser-known L-1 visa. And the L-1's been growing in popularity. The L-1 was designed to be used by foreign companies to place employees into the U.S. for the purpose of starting up the presence, foreign companies' presence here. And it has the advantage that there's no cap on these visas and that the wages are not subject to U.S. or state minimum wage laws. The largest user of both of these visas, both the H-1B and the L-1, are not U.S. companies looking to hire talent. The largest user is foreign temp agencies placing contractors here in the U.S. And with that background, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my previous job at a company called IGT. IGT is a Nevada-based company that is the largest manufacturer of slot machines in the world. IGT purchased a company called Acres Gaming, based in Corvallis, Oregon, in order to acquire what was known as their bonus pool technology. A slot machine bonus pool is a way for large jackpots in a casino to accumulate across a network of slot machines. I started at IGT in August of 2008, and I was earning a very good salary of $90K per year. After being unemployed for 3 out of the previous 6 years, a $90,000 per year job was not something I could just pass up. However, to do so, I had to move away from my family, my friends, and my home. After 4 months on this job, in December of 2008, IGT announced it was opening a new office in Beijing, China. We were told this was done because IGT couldn't find qualified people in the U.S., and that's a quote, despite the fact that we were in the midst of the largest economic downturn since the Great Depression. I was assigned a new manager to my group, and before I even spoke with him about what my current tasks were, he told me, and I'll quote, "Give every task you can to the Chinese." The company began bringing newly hired Chinese employees over in pairs for a month at a time to be trained in the U.S. Then they were sent back to China and a new pair was brought over. In addition, the more experienced IGT employees, and I was not one of them, were sent to China to train them in Beijing. The number of Chinese employees eventually grew to 2 Chinese workers for every U.S. worker we had. In December of 2009, an accidental, some question whether it was accidental, leak occurred at IGT, and it was disclosed that they were going to be closing the Corvallis plant. At the official announcement of the closure, we asked if our jobs were being moved to China, and we were told flat out no. Jobs were not being sent overseas. This was not offshoring. It was simply a consolidation of offices. We were told that if anyone wanted to keep their job, they simply had to move to Las Vegas. When pressed, they said that they said there would be an additional 50 new openings in the China office, but no new jobs in Nevada. The VP then proceeded to tell us, and I don't know why he said this is good for all of us, and by that I mean it's good for you, and it's good for me, everyone here. Later, when the management saw how many people wanted to make the move to Las Vegas, they retracted their offer and said only 7 people could stay out of the 57 total Corvallis employees. And 3 of those were going to be the 3 managers at the plant. However, we did have a handful of L1 visas, which I mentioned earlier, and they were contract software programmers from India. Some of these contractors were kept, but they were sent to China, and their rate was dropped from $7 an hour to $3 an hour. In the end, we filed for trade adjustment assistance to obtain retraining money from the U.S. Department of Labor, and they agreed that our jobs were indeed offshored and that we qualified for retraining funds. But it's important to note that the cost of this retraining is being paid by taxes, and none of it is coming from IGT. So, to continue, I have to talk a little bit about trade theory. And for those who don't know these terms, you'll get to hear them. For those who do know these terms, you'll just bear with me a moment. But I'd like to talk about 2 economic terms, absolute advantage and comparative advantage. And to do that tonight, I guess I need 2 victims. And I know Arthur asked me to speak tonight, so I'm going to pick him as one of my victims. And Barbara's smiling at me, so she'll be my second.
Such punishment.
Yes, and I have bad news for the I have bad news for the both of you. You've both been shipwrecked on a desert island.
Sounds
Okay.
good, actually.
Well, maybe it is. And this island, just to be clear, it has no phone, no lights, no motor car, not a single luxury. One might even say it's as primitive as can be. So, let's say there's only 2 jobs in this island. The first is fishing, which is the only source of protein available. And let's say, Barbara, you're twice as good at fishing as Arthur. Okay?
Right.
This would mean that Barbara has what's known as an absolute advantage at fishing. And the second job on any good island is coconut gathering. You get that? Okay. However, when it comes to the coconut gathering business, sorry to tell you, Arthur, Barbara's also better. But she's not just twice as good. She's 3 times as good. She's winning at everything. And this means that Barbara, well, this does mean that Barbara does have an absolute advantage at fishing. This means that Barbara does have an absolute advantage at fishing. Arthur has the comparative advantage at fishing because he's less bad at it. So that's the difference between the 2. Hopefully that's clear. And if you're willing to do a little bit of math, which we're not going to do tonight, it'll be clear that if Arthur spends all his time fishing and Barbara spends her entire time gathering coconuts, since she's 3 times better at it, and they're willing to do trading, then they'll both do better than if they each just did both jobs. And that's the basis of what free trade's about. What's important to note here is that even though Barbara is better at fishing than Arthur, and even though she hates climbing trees and loves fishing, if economics is the only consideration, then Barbara is never going to be fishing. Sorry. It's a simple story, but likewise, free trade theory predicts that even if the U.S. has a strong absolute advantage in high-tech over Korea, we would not keep those high-tech jobs without having a comparative advantage. And they're a big difference. And this is regardless of how much you would be preferring to do this high-tech work. It makes no difference, not if that's the decision. So according to the theory, If free trade is to work, the following has to be true. Retraining has no costs. It's just as easy to switch between those two jobs. There has to be zero cost to the transportation of the goods that are being produced. We have to disallow the movement of production across the borders, and we have to limit an individual's ability to choose a career. Those are given. But in addition, companies are not valuing families and communities when moving offshore. So I can tell you, nobody at the company cared about closing down the facility. The retraining costs, as I mentioned, are not being paid by the companies. It's being borne by taxpayers. And further, workers are losing valuable skills, and in many cases, those skills take decades to obtain. Korea is a modern country with a highly educated and very technologically savvy workforce. While it may be possible we have an absolute advantage, there's no reason to think we have any sort of a comparative advantage over Korea. Therefore, it's reasonable to expect the Korean Freight Trade Agreement will not move a single high-tech job to Oregon. And now that the Supreme Court, in conclusion, now that the Supreme Court has decided that corporations have the same rights of people, I've been thinking to myself, if corporations are people, then why are corporations free to move across borders to reduce their costs, while workers are not free to move across borders for better wages?
So you have sort of a picture here of why this trade deal would be a bad idea. I think most of you already know that these trade agreements are a bad idea, but now we're armed with, a little more facts. Let me talk a little bit about the timing. I mentioned that the president is hoping to make an announcement at the G20 meeting in South Korea right after the election that they've reached a deal. They're not talking about renegotiating what Bush put together 3 years ago. They're talking about potentially doing some side agreements. And the side agreements that they're talking about right now have to do with access to the Korean market for U.S. automobiles and U.S. beef, which, are potentially good things and would be improvements for workers here. What they're trying to do to the Koreans, though, is to get them to sign waivers on their environmental regulations because they have harder air quality standards, and on their food safety standards because they have higher food safety standards. So that's not entirely positive. The USTR has been completely resistant to address any other issue like investment, like financial services, like stronger labor provisions or any of that. So I was heard just this week that the USTR has been meeting with the South Korean government, that they're still very much intending to have this deal worked out on those two issues, the cars and the cows, by the G20 meeting, and to announce that they're ready to roll it out and move forward. If that happens as expected, it's possible that the FTA could be brought up for a lame duck vote. I think it's much more likely it'll come up next session. There'll theoretically be more Republicans in there, in which case you could expect it to be introduced in February, would be my guess. Let's just be clear for a second. If this is introduced and it's under fast track, because Bush signed it the day that fast track was expiring, and so it's under fast track, if this is introduced, presumably almost all the Republicans are going to vote for it. Then you really only need a handful of Democrats, depending on the outcome of the election, and it's going to pass. So our job is hopefully preventing it from even being introduced. And our time frame is between now and February to do that. The more successful we are, the further it's going to get pushed back. It's not like you should expect some announcement, we've given up on the Korea Free Trade Agreement and we're going to support fair trade. I mean, that's not how these things work. They get dragged out and dragged out and dragged out, but there is sort of a deadline for how far they can drag this out. The reason why we're not having a vote on this now is because there's an election, and they don't want voters thinking about it. They don't want voters thinking about this, as I've already said, in 2012. So they want to do it as close as possible to the start of the session as they can. Come, June or July of next year, we're back in presidential election season. At that point, it's very, very unlikely that the president is going to choose to be introducing a free trade agreement. even if he's on the same side as the Republican candidate on the issue. So, between now and February is when we need to be making the most noise. And if we're successful and it's not introduced in February, we got to sustain that till about the spring, the summer, at which point we've won. Okay, so that's the timing on this. It's not impossible. I mentioned already the divisions that are showing up in the White House. This happened last year when they were talking about passing the Panama Free Trade Agreement. There was enough pressure that they decided better, and they didn't do that. We're hoping that we can do that again. And the divisions are, you've got the U.S. Trade Representative who, for the most part in that office are all appointees who've been there, through the Bush years, through the Clinton years, through the Bush years, Reagan years, going back however far. They're all, diehard free traders. So they're saying, we got to do this, we got to do this. The president's economic advisors, unfortunately, for the most part, the Tim Geithners, were in around the Clinton era. They gave us NAFTA and the WTO in the first place. Geithner was one of the major trade negotiators on. So yeah, he wasn't one of the negotiators, but he oversaw for, I think it was Treasury, the financial services negotiations. So they're on a certain side. They're sort of camped out. The allies that we have in the White House aren't people who are with us on the issues. They're people who can read a poll and who know that, hey, this is really risky, and we need to make it riskier. And so, one of the things that people are doing around the country is trying to make trade an issue in this election. I know in Oregon we have fewer races where that's possible, but David Wu has been strongly moved in our direction in recent years on trade, thanks to a lot of work of people in this audience. He's voted against the Peru Free Trade Agreement. Back in the day, he voted against China being able to join the WTO. He's a co-sponsor on the Trade Act. Just this week, he wrote to the president, the U.S. is negotiating a new Trans-Pacific Partnership, a new Pacific Rim Trade Agreement. Negotiations are happening in the Sultanate of Brunei as we speak. And David Wu said, should we really be doing trade negotiations in a country where there's no free press and we can't even find out what's going on? So he was willing to raise that issue, and so he's a champion. Down south we've got Peter DeFazio, who's doing good. But the main target, the main reason why Oregon is important is because, and I think some of you know this already, is that Senator Ron Wyden now chairs the Senate Subcommittee on International Trade for the first time this session. He's been on the Senate Finance Committee for quite a while, but now he's in charge of the subcommittee that considers trade policy. So him, making the slightest bit of noise about this agreement would be very, very positive for us. I'm not expecting, I don't think anyone should expect that Ron Wyden is suddenly going to become a fair trade champion in the rest of his career. But it is possible that with enough pressure, he might get the political message, and he might communicate that, for the sake and the good of his party. And one of the issues, actually, that his office has suggested that they might show leadership on is the investment issue. He hasn't really been that concerned about the job loss issue, unfortunately. But he does sort of get the investment issue. So what we're asking people to do is to individually put calls into Ron Wyden. Again, we don't think he's going to change his position, but he needs to feel that people get this is happening, that they're not going to sneak it through, that there is going to be a political price to pay if they move forward with it. So we're trying to do that, and one of the handouts we had out front, if you didn't grab it on your way in, has his phone number on it. It has talking points. How many people are a member of a trade union, labor union in here? Alrighty. What I would ask of you is that you go to your local and ask for 5 minutes on the agenda of an upcoming meeting and share some of what you've learned today. And there's those talking points there. If you need it, I'm happy to come in and do it myself. We might be able to recruit someone else. But I think try it yourself. Honestly, Ron Wyden is not going to be unelected on this issue, but they're not going to weigh the decision not to do this based on the merits of the issue. They're going to weigh it based on, are people talking about this? Do people care about this? Is this an issue that people care, are going to even know about or remember about? And so for that reason, we're trying to generate pressure in Oregon on Ron Wyden. In other states as other folks. I think there's a larger conversation to be had about how do we get representatives who actually represent our interests. And I think Barbara could probably answer that question as well as anyone on this panel, anyhow. But let's get into that. So I would ask each of you to please, get that time on your next meeting. If you're part of a faith group, an environmental club, whatever, get the word out, because the corporate media, again, isn't going to do it. KBOO, Public Access, have been talking about this story, but, the Oregonian hasn't, Fox News hasn't. They're not going to. It's up to us.